Welcome back to my channel. Please ignore my ugly bun. That's as good as it's getting. So once again, my notes, if you see me looking down, I actually took handwritten notes too, so look at me. Welcome back to Serial Killer Sundays, episode 2. Today we're doing Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, with 17 murdered in total. He's also known for cannibalism with necrophiliation too, if that's a word. Y'all get me right. On May 21st, 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer was born to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Jeff's father described this time of his birth as a very happy and exciting time for the family, as it was their firstborn. They were very excited to have welcoming a new life. Lionel described Jeff as a very outgoing, curious child. He was always going outside and just exploring things like any young boy would. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, got his PhD in chemistry and moved the family to Ohio in a nice wooded area, about 2 acres of land their house was on. And whenever they first moved to the house, Lionel had to go under the house and get some bones of dead animals that were underneath the house. He went under the house, got the bones out, and put them in a metal pail, like the ones that you use at the beach, but a metal one. And whenever he put the bones in, it made like clanking noises, and Lionel could tell that Jeffrey was very fascinated with the noise and just like seeing the bones in general. When the family moved to Ohio, Jeffrey became very shy and awkward. He was what you would consider a loner, sort of. His parents gave him a dog named Frisky to just make him feel better. The Dahmers, Lionel and Joyce, started noticing that Jeff felt kind of left out, sort of. So whenever their new son was brought into the world, they let Jeff pick his name, which he chose David for his little brother. So they let him choose the name so he could feel more included in the family and actually have a part of something. Lionel always encouraged his son to participate in more human contact activities to try and help him with his human involvement with other people, just getting more interactions with people and just trying to connect with people. When Jeffrey was 10, his mother Joyce was hospitalized for anxiety, and after that their marriage began to fail very quickly. Things just went downhill after she was in the hospital. His fascination with bones and just animals in general continued to grow over this time. He then began to collect roadkill off the side of the road and insects, bugs, whatever he could find, and he would start to dissect them in his backyard. Jeff claims that he wanted to know how the animals and insects or whatever he found looked on the inside and how they fit together. As Jeff moved into his teenage years, the way he saw his classmates felt about women was how he felt about men. And during this time, this was not a very common concept of a man with another man or a woman with another woman. He started to have fantasies about men also, not just sexually.
I think it was around age 14 or 15. Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't. Just kept it all inside.
One of his early fantasies of his that he had was to lie next to a unconscious or dead man. He planned to fulfill this fantasy as he would go to a park every day and watch this jogger run. He planned one day to go, and he took a bat and he was planning to knock out the jogger and just lie next to him. He didn't get to fulfill this plan because the jogger didn't run the day that he went. All these sexual fantasies that he was having kind of scared Jeff because he didn't know what to do or who to talk to or how to deal with it. So he began drinking very heavily in his early teenage years. He would even take a styrofoam cup and fill it up with hard liquor and bring it to class. His classmates would ask him what was in his cup, and they knew it was like liquor or beer, but Jeff would just always say it's his medicine. Around this time also, Jeff's parents' marriage was dissolving very quickly, and their marriage started leading to more open fighting in front of the kids. Jeff had no real close friends. He was known to have a very great sense of humor. He became known as the class clown.
All of a sudden, you'd be walking down the hall and you'd hear someone yelling and hollering and running through the hallway, and it's Jeff Dahmer in the middle of the day, running, flapping his arms, yelling, hurricane drill, everybody hide.
In school, he was also a part of the tennis team and also spent some time in the school band. When Jeff would act out and do something crazy, the classmates would call it doing a Dahmer. In the classroom, he was considered to be a model student.
Dressed very nice, very respectful to teachers. Did his work. He could be an A student if he wanted to. Other times he would fail a class because he had no interest. He could be very polite with very good manners. Yes, sir. No, sir, when he spoke with teachers.
In 1978, Jeff graduated from high school, and after his graduation, his parents did divorce. His father moved out and started living into a hotel, while not soon after, his mother and his brother moved to Wisconsin, leaving Jeff home by himself. During this time, he kept having sexual fantasies still, and the isolation of the family home gave him more of an opportunity to act on these fantasies. Weeks after graduation, Jeffrey picked up 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker. Jeff invited Hicks back to his house, and they drank beers and spent a couple hours just hanging out and talking. Then Hicks said he had to go. Jeff claims he didn't want to be alone. He attacked Hicks with a barbell, knocking him out on the back of the head, and then began to strangle him. He had fulfilled his fantasy that he had, but he was lucid enough to realize that he had committed a murder and quickly began to get rid of the evidence. He then began to dismember Hicks' body with a knife, a skill he had learned very young as he was always dissecting animals. He then put the pieces in trash bags and loaded them into his car at night and headed for a dump site. Jeff was then pulled over by the police on the way to the dump site for drifting over into the other lane because he was in fact drunk. The officer began to ask him what was in the bags and why he was out so late. Jeff was ready with a lie to tell the cop and began to tell him that he was troubled by his parents' divorce and he couldn't sleep, so he was making a trip to the dump to get things off his mind. The officer began to let him go with just a ticket. Jeff then returned home and stashed the bones under the house for 2 weeks, then smashed them to bits with a sledgehammer and tossed the fragments all over his backyard. In August, Jeffrey's father, Lionel, then stopped by the house.
I said, "Where is your mother? Where's Dave?" And he said, "They're gone." I said, "Well, what do you mean? They're gone? They've left."
Jeff's father moved back into the house. He encouraged Jeff to find a job. But Jeff wasn't interested. He spent his days drinking, even getting himself arrested for public intoxication. Lionel took his son to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and psychological counseling sessions. They had little impact. Nothing could erase the violence and terror his first murder had imprinted on his mind. Only the alcohol seemed to provide relief. By the end of the summer, Jeff was still jobless, so Lionel suggested an alternative, college. He enrolled Jeff at Ohio State. But Jeff spent the entire first quarter in a drunken stupor, selling his blood to plasma centers and spending the money on beer. Predictably, Dahmer flunked out and returned home.
I said, "Jeff, the doors are closing. I think perhaps that the armed services might be something that you need."
Jeff enlisted into the Army, and after basic training, he left for an Army hospital in San Antonio, Texas, where he was given specialized instruction as a field medic, which only led him to learn more about human anatomy. For one of the first times in Jeff's life, he was actually excited about what he was doing. After 6 months in the Army, he became lean, strong, and was actually seen smiling. The Army sent him for a tour in Germany, and there once again he began drinking bottle after bottle, and his superiors noticed and gave him an early discharge. Following this discharge, he didn't tell anybody. He went directly to Miami, where he would work in a sandwich shop and begin living out of a hotel. When his bills for his alcohol addiction began to exceed his payment for the hotel he was staying in, Jeff took to sleeping on the beach.
And he was terrified one night when a big huge rat came crawling over him, and he called us. He said, he needs some money. I said, we won't send you money, but we'll send you a ticket. You come home.
Lionel had tried for a year to help his alcoholic son change his ways. With no luck, he then sent Jeff to stay at his grandmother's house in Milwaukee. During this time at Jeff's grandma's, he began to go to church with her. He actually stopped drinking during this time. After 3 quiet years at his grandmother's house, a man handed Jeff a note at a local library offering him sexual favors. Dahmer declined the note. However, later in interviews, he has claimed to say that this was the official turning point. He would explore bathhouses and clubs, and this is where he started giving men laced drinks with sleeping pills, and then once the man would fall unconscious, he would then lie next to him. He claimed he just wanted to hear the sounds of their bodies. At the beginning of his killing spree, this was his original MO. He just wanted to lie next to men and just listen to their bodies. He claims that he did not want to kill anybody. The crazy thing about Jeffrey Dahmer that makes him so interesting and so different is that he could fit in with any group and no one would suspect that, oh, that guy must be a killer. He had good looks, he could fit in with anybody. Dahmer didn't have a specific type that he would go after. It didn't matter the race, the skin color, the type, age, it didn't matter. In November 1987, Jeff met Steve Toomey, 25-year-old, in a club downtown called 219. After a few drinks at the bar, Jeff lured Steve to his hotel at the Ambassador. Dahmer then began to put sleeping pills in his drink, and which led to Steve becoming unconscious. He completely blacked out. He says he claims that he doesn't remember killing him. Once Jeff had realized that he had killed Steve, he did not panic. He then quickly began to leave and go to a store and buy the biggest suitcase he could find. He then came back to the hotel and began to cram Steve's body inside the suitcase and drug it downstairs. Then he began to drag the suitcase into a taxi, which the taxi then took him back to his grandmother's house. This is the first time Jeff had actually tried to preserve a part of a man's body. He tried to save Steve's head, but then quickly realized that he didn't have the correct stuff for that and it wasn't working, so then he began to get rid of his head also. Dahmer then began to return to the bar. On January 16th, 1988, Jeff was outside 219, the bar, and he met 14-year-old James Tater. Jeff offered him $50 to spend the night with him, which then the boy accepted, and they took the bus back to his grandmother's house. While his grandmother slept, Jeff and Tater then began to have a physical interaction. Then Dahmer would begin to drug and strangle him. This was the first murder that Jeff began to explore more, and he would then begin to keep James's body for 2 weeks in the basement. Jeff now began to drink very heavily on the nights he would plan to murder. March 24th, 1988, Dahmer picked up 21-year-old Richard Guerrero from a Milwaukee bar, offering him money to spend the night with him. He also then drugged and strangled him. Jeff would then spend a few hours with the corpse before beginning to dismember him. He then placed the body parts in trash bags and left them out for the garbage the next day. The summer of 1988, Jeff's grandmother had asked Jeff to move out. She was very concerned about the smell coming from the basement, and she was also very troubled by the late hours that Jeff would be coming in and the men that he would be bringing into the house. Jeff then took an apartment on Milwaukee's west side, and this just gave him the more space that he needed and also continued to add on to his downward spiral. Outside of his apartment, Jeffrey saw a boy walking down the street and began to lure him into his apartment. This 13-year-old boy then went inside the apartment and began to get very scared once Jeff fondled him, and ran outside the apartment. Dahmer was convicted on second-degree sexual assault charges and had 1 year in prison. He also received a 1 year in a work release program, which required him to spend his nights in a prison dormitory. The police never investigated Dahmer, which means that all the murders that he had committed before were still unknown to the police. 10 days before Dahmer's sentence started, he met 26-year-old Anthony Sears at a gay club. He would then kill him, and this is the first time he tried to mummify parts. He mummified Sears' head and other parts, you get what I mean, and kept them inside his locker at his job at the chocolate factory. At the near end of Dahmer's work release program, Lionel, Dahmer's father, wrote a letter to the judge saying if he could please put Jeff in a program for alcoholism or any type of program just to help him because he needed help. The judge then began to ignore the letter, and Dahmer got released from his program 2 months early. 3 weeks after his release from jail, Jeff went on a killing frenzy. After prison, Jeff's victims became more specific. He had different requirements. After he got out of jail, he mainly went for African American men. In the year of 1990, Jeff will kill 13 men. A 14-year-old boy named Conorak was lured into Jeff's apartment. Conorak then fell asleep, and Jeff did something he had never done before. He actually decided to leave and go get liquor from the store. During this time that Jeff was gone, the boy woke up and obviously was very scared, so then he began to run out of the apartment. As Conorak started running down the street, a neighbor saw, and they called the police saying that a boy was running down the street with no clothes on. The police happened to show up the same time that Jeff did, and Jeff claimed that Conorak was his boyfriend and that he had too much to drink that night. Jeff even began to invite the police back to his apartment, and the police believed him and left them alone. After murdering so many, the bodies in his apartment started to pile up. So then Jeff purchased a 57-gallon drum and put acid in it along with torsos. Jeff would also sometimes cook the skin of his victims on the stove. As this continued, neighbors started noticing foul smells coming from Jeff's apartment. They also noticed that Jeff never came home with groceries or food, so they were very confused as to what the smell was coming from and what he could be cooking. Along with being a necrophiliac, Jeff was also a cannibal. He claims he didn't want his victims to leave him, so he then began to eat them so they would stay with him. This is mainly blamed on his abandonment issues. As a child, he didn't have the best family, so he always felt like people were leaving his life, so he didn't want these men to leave also. In 1991, Tracy Edwards was convinced by Jeff to spend the night with him. As Tracy went into the apartment, he had a feeling in his gut that something wasn't right about Jeff. He then was able to escape the room and ran outside and ran down the street, where he then saw a cop car and began to wave him down. He then began to tell the cop that there was something really wrong with Jeff and they needed to check it out. The cop called for backup, and they went to his apartment and began to go inside. None of the cops were prepared or could ever be prepared for what they were about to see. Many of the officers that arrived on the scene had to leave because they got sick to their stomach. As the officers went in, they found 83 Polaroid pictures of dismembered body parts. The officer then opened the fridge and found decapitated heads. They also started noticing pots and pans filled with dismembered body parts on the stove, along with multiple torsos in the 57-gallon drum. Jeff was immediately taken to the police station and arrested. Jeff then began to blame his problems on his alcohol addiction. Over the next 6 weeks, the police would get a confession from Jeff, where it would end up being 157 pages long. During the trial, Jeff pled guilty, but he also pled insanity. Jeff's father, Lionel, sat through the entire trial and was in so much disbelief that his son could commit these murders. The jury then found Dahmer legally sane and sentenced him to 937 years in prison. While in prison, Jeff decided that he wanted to change his life. He got baptized in 1994. His dad said that he noticed a change in Jeff, that he was becoming more human. He was humanizing, and his father could see. On November 29th, 1994, Jeff was in the prison gym, and an inmate had came up to him and stabbed him. Jeff would then later die in the hospital that day. Stay tuned for next week, where I'll be covering the life of Ted Bundy, which I know is a hot topic right now because of that new trailer with Zac Efron or whatever. But yeah, I'm gonna jump in and give y'all the tea. But I hope y'all enjoy this video. Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, I hope y'all enjoy, and thank you for watching.